Okay, so today we're going to be tackling a topic that is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
The situation in Gaza, following the Hamas attacks on Israel back in October 2023. And to guide us, we've got this report from Amnesty International.
Right.
It's called, and get ready for this title, "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman: Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza." So
Heavy stuff.
it's going to be heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And to help us break all this down, we've got
For having me.
an expert on the program today. Right off the bat, Amnesty's conclusion is pretty stark.
Yeah, they don't mince words.
They're saying that Israel committed prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention.
That's right.
During its offensive in Gaza. And we should say right up front, we know that this is a very sensitive topic.
Oh, incredibly.
And people have really strong feelings about it.
Yeah.
And our goal here is to really just break down the information that is in this report.
Right.
No opinions.
Just the facts.
Taking sides.
Just trying to understand what Amnesty is arguing and the evidence they're presenting.
Exactly. And then you can draw your own conclusions.
Exactly.
So to set the stage, even before the offensive in 2023, Gaza was already in a really, really tough spot.
Absolutely.
I mean, over 70% of the people living there were refugees.
Or descendants of refugees.
Of course, they're descendants.
Yeah.
And they had been living under Israeli control for decades.
Decades, yeah. And that control has taken many forms. You know, there was military occupation, and more recently it's been this blockade that severely limits what can go in and out of Gaza.
Right.
So you're talking about a population that was already incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, really existing in these tough conditions. And then on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched these attacks on Israel.
Right.
Obviously, a horrifying event.
Tragic. Lots of civilian casualties.
Many, many civilian casualties. And just to be crystal clear, though, our focus today is on what happened in Gaza after those attacks.
Exactly. We're looking at how Israel responded to those attacks.
Right.
And whether Amnesty's evidence supports their accusation of genocide.
Right. And that response was intense.
It was.
I mean, they launched airstrikes.
Airstrikes, ground troops.
Cut off communications.
Total communication blackout.
It's just the scale of it is really hard to grasp.
Yeah.
They claim to have hit 30,000 targets in Gaza.
Wow.
Which, as you can imagine, it's a very densely populated place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just the sheer asymmetry of the conflict is really striking.
Absolutely.
And then you have this word genocide. It's not something that you just throw around lightly.
No, it's a very loaded term.
And we want to be really clear about what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So can you sort of break down what genocide actually means?
Yeah, so it's not just about killing.
Right.
It's about a deliberate plan to destroy an entire group of people. Think of it like trying to completely wipe out a species, like the dodo bird.
Right.
That level of intent is what makes a genocide.
Okay, so Amnesty in this report digs into several specific things that they say point to this intent.
Okay.
They investigated a number of mass killings, injuries from Israeli airstrikes. For example, they described this attack on the Al-Nakla family home,
Right.
where 4 civilians, including 2 children, were killed.
Right.
And there was the attack on the Jabalia refugee camp market.
Yeah, horrific.
Where at least 70 civilians died. And these are just 2 of the many incidents that they investigated.
Right.
But it goes beyond just the attacks themselves.
That's right.
Amnesty says that Israel also deliberately created conditions that were designed to make life impossible for Palestinians in Gaza.
So not just the direct attacks.
Not just the attack.
But also the conditions on the ground.
They're pointing to things like the destruction of essential infrastructure.
Water.
Power plants.
Power plants. Hospitals.
Water treatment facilities.
The stuff people need to survive.
Hospitals.
No.
The stuff that people need to survive. Plus, there was that blockade and the severe restrictions on humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. Like, imagine trying to feed your family when there's practically no food available.
Right.
And you have no idea when help might arrive.
Yeah, the report actually includes firsthand accounts from people who were living through that exact situation.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful.
And then there were these evacuation orders where Palestinians were told to leave their homes.
Right.
You can really see the impact of these orders in these maps that Amnesty provides in their report.
Yeah, they visually demonstrate how Palestinians were systematically squeezed into smaller and smaller areas.
Right.
Which raises a big question, right?
Yeah.
What was the goal of this strategy?
Amnesty says there were 3 waves of these forced displacements,
Yeah.
and each one created more chaos, more fear,
Right.
pushing people into these increasingly dangerous and overcrowded areas.
Yeah, and it really highlights the systematic nature of these displacements.
Right.
It wasn't just random. There seemed to be a clear strategy at play.
Now, this is where things get especially disturbing.
Okay.
Amnesty also points to the language that was used by some Israeli officials during the offensive.
Uh-huh.
And the language seems to have been directly connected to what was happening on the ground.
Okay.
So it raises this really important question about the role of language in shaping perceptions, justifying actions,
Right.
even during wartime. So some of the things that were said by high-ranking officials are honestly shocking. Then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called Palestinians human animals, for example.
Wow.
And the head of Kogat, Ghassan Alian, referred to them as human beasts.
Hmm.
So you have this kind of dehumanizing language, which is a huge red flag.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have this repeated use of biblical references,
Oh.
specifically invoking the Amalekites. Can you sort of unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so the Amalekites were an ancient enemy of the Israelites. They're described in the Bible as people who should be completely wiped out.
Okay.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu himself brought up this narrative several times during the offensive.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
And there's documentation of some soldiers on the ground actually interpreting these references as justification for violence against Palestinians in Gaza.
So using this ancient religious text to justify modern-day violence.
It's really troubling how these religious narratives can be twisted to justify atrocities.
Dehumanize entire groups of people.
Dehumanize entire groups of people. And it's not just limited to a few isolated incidents. Amnesty provides other examples of derogatory terms that were used by Israeli officials and politicians to refer to Palestinians. And this kind of rhetoric creates this climate where violence becomes more acceptable.
It erodes the very concept of human dignity.
It really does.
Yeah.
Beyond the language, Amnesty also looked into the destruction of cultural and religious sites in Gaza, often with no clear military reason. So, for instance, they found evidence that the destruction of the Al-Azhar University campus was a planned demolition, not just collateral damage.
Wow.
They documented soldiers planting explosives there. And then there's the Al-Zahra campus of Israel University, which was demolished after being used as an Israeli military base. And this, according to Amnesty, is further indication of intentional destruction.
So it raises this alarming possibility that they weren't just trying to eliminate the physical presence of Palestinians,
Right.
but to erase their culture and history too.
So with all of this happening, what was the international community doing? I mean, the world was watching this unfold, right?
Well, there were a lot of strong statements, condemnations, calls for peace.
Yeah.
But if you look closer, you see a lot of inaction.
Mm-hmm.
The UN Security Council, they tried to pass resolutions demanding humanitarian access and a ceasefire,
Right.
but the U.S. vetoed one of them, which effectively blocked any real action.
So even with all this condemnation, not a lot was actually being done to stop it.
Right, it really highlights the limitations of international institutions
Right.
in these kinds of situations.
Yeah.
Especially when you have powerful countries involved.
Right. Right. The International Court of Justice also stepped in,
Yeah.
issuing these orders demanding that Israel ensure aid delivery and civilian protection.
Right, but those orders were largely ignored.
And what about the International Criminal Court?
Yeah.
They were investigating potential crimes committed during the offensive, right?
Yes, they even issued arrest warrants for both Israeli and Hamas leaders.
Okay. But even with all that, Israel's main allies, particularly the U.S. and Germany, continued supplying them with weapons.
Right, it definitely raises questions about how committed those countries really are to holding anyone accountable.
So you have all this condemnation, resolutions being passed, courts stepping in, and yet the violence continued, the humanitarian crisis worsened, and there's this sense of nobody being held responsible.
It's a pretty sobering picture, and it raises these bigger questions about whether international law actually has any teeth.
Right.
Whether it can really prevent or punish atrocities like what we're seeing in Gaza.
It's easy to get lost in the details of the conflict, but what's fascinating to me is how the situation in Gaza and even the language we were just talking about ties into these larger global trends.
Absolutely. You're talking about the rise of nationalism, this increasing division we see in societies, and even the use of religion to justify violence. We're seeing these trends pop up all over the world.
Yeah, it's almost like a familiar pattern. You dehumanize the other, make them seem like this existential threat, and suddenly any action against them becomes justifiable.
It's a disturbingly common playbook.
Yeah,
And it becomes even more dangerous when you mix in deep-seated religious beliefs.
because then it's not just a political disagreement. It becomes a battle of good versus evil.
Exactly. It creates this conflict where compromise or negotiation seems impossible because one side believes they're literally carrying out God's will
Right.
by eliminating the other.
Thinking about it that way makes the situation seem almost hopeless.
I wouldn't say hopeless, but it definitely emphasizes the need to understand this wider context.
Right.
Right? These trends aren't inevitable.
So what can actually be done?
Well, for one, we have to be more aware of the language being used. We have to call out dehumanizing rhetoric, no matter who it's coming from.
Even if it's someone we generally agree with.
Especially then. It's too easy to become complacent and accept that kind of language if it's directed at a group we don't sympathize with. We can't let ourselves fall into that trap.
You're right. That is a trap I've fallen into before.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it like that.
We also have to actively support initiatives that promote dialogue and understanding between different groups.
So building empathy, basically.
Yes, exactly. It's about helping people see each other as human beings with their own hopes and fears and dreams, not just as some faceless, threatening other.
That's a tall order in a world that feels so increasingly divided.
It is. But it's absolutely necessary if we want to prevent more conflicts like the one we're seeing in Gaza.
Okay, shifting gears back to Amnesty's report for a second.
Okay.
They spent a lot of time explaining this concept of intent to destroy, which seems to be like a really crucial part of proving genocide.
Absolutely.
Right.
It is. And remember, it's not enough to just show that terrible things happened, right?
Right.
To establish genocide, you have to prove that those actions were taken with the specific goal of destroying a particular group.
So how does Amnesty try to do that?
So they analyze the statements made by Israeli officials, the policies that their government put in place,
Okay.
and the actions of their military during the offensive.
Mm-hmm.
They're essentially looking for connections, for patterns that reveal a deeper motive.
And one of their arguments is that Israel intentionally created conditions in Gaza that were meant to be destructive, to make life impossible for Palestinians there.
Right, and they offer several examples to back that up. The destruction of essential infrastructure, the blockade that limited humanitarian aid, the mass displacement of civilians through those evacuation orders. Amnesty argues that all of these actions were deliberate.
Right.
A calculated effort to create a situation where Palestinians in Gaza couldn't survive.
And they link this back to that disturbing rhetoric we discussed earlier, right?
Absolutely.
That dehumanizing language used by some Israeli officials.
Right. That kind of talk creates a climate where these actions become more likely, more acceptable. It's almost like setting the stage for violence by portraying Palestinians as less than human, so their suffering doesn't really matter.
Amnesty also brings up the destruction of cultural and religious sites in Gaza, right?
Yes. They investigated a number of cases where the destruction seemed deliberate, like there was no military reason for it. They go into detail about the demolition of the Al-Azhar University campus, for example. Soldiers were seen planting explosives there, which strongly suggests a planned demolition, not just something that happened in the crossfire.
And then there's the Al-Zahra campus of Israel University, which was demolished after being used as an Israeli military base.
Right.
Again, Amnesty argues this points to intentional destruction.
It raises this alarming possibility that they weren't just trying to eliminate the physical presence of Palestinians in Gaza, but to erase their culture and history, too.
It's incredibly disturbing. But Amnesty does acknowledge that some of these acts, if you looked at them individually, could be seen as violations of international humanitarian law rather than outright genocide.
Right. They recognize that there's a potential counter-argument there. Some might say, okay, Israel committed war crimes.
Right.
But not genocide.
But Amnesty ultimately disagrees with that, right?
Yes. They argue that the scale of the destruction, the targeting of civilians and essential infrastructure, the rhetoric used by Israeli officials, and the overall context all point to a genocidal intent.
So they're saying, even if some of these actions on their own might be considered war crimes, when you look at the whole picture, it paints a much more sinister story.
Exactly. It's about looking at the big picture, the motivations behind the actions. Because genocide is a crime of intent. It's not just about the outcome, but the thought process behind it.
So what does all of this mean? What are the implications of Amnesty's report?
Well, for one thing, it demands a serious reevaluation of the situation in Gaza and the actions of the Israeli government. This isn't just another report about human rights violations. It's an accusation of genocide,
Right.
which carries a lot of weight. It requires a response, not only from Israel, but from the entire international community.
What kind of response?
At the very least, it calls for a thorough and impartial investigation into these accusations.
But as we saw, even when international courts get involved, it's often difficult to achieve any real accountability.
That's true. But it's still important to pursue justice, to hold those responsible accountable. It sends a clear message that genocide won't be tolerated.
Beyond the legal side of things, what else needs to happen?
We need a fundamental shift in how the international community deals with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So not just treating the symptoms, but addressing the root causes.
Exactly. We have to challenge the systems of oppression that allowed this conflict to drag on for so long.
Amnesty talks about Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and its system of apartheid against Palestinians.
Right. They argue that these systems are the foundation upon which these atrocities have been built.
Right.
And as long as they remain in place, we're likely to see more cycles of violence and suffering.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, but it's also a call to action. We can't just stand by and watch history repeat itself. We have a responsibility to speak out, to demand justice, and to work towards a future where peace and human dignity are a reality for everyone involved.
Okay, we've talked about the bigger picture, the specific evidence Amnesty presents, and the implications of their report. But what about the human cost of this conflict?
That's perhaps the most important aspect of all this.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of human suffering is unimaginable.
Yeah, the report includes some truly harrowing accounts from people who lived through the offensive.
Yes, and those stories are essential to hear. They remind us that behind all the statistics, behind the legal arguments, there are real people whose lives have been shattered by this conflict.
Amnesty quotes this father who had to resort to feeding his children leaves and bread made from animal fodder because there was no real food available.
It's heartbreaking to imagine the desperation, the heartbreak of that situation.
Right.
And it wasn't an isolated incident. Countless families were struggling to survive with virtually no food, water, or medical supplies.
And even those who did survive the offensive are now facing long-term physical and psychological trauma. I mean, the impact of this conflict will be felt for generations to come.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the presence of justice, equality, and opportunity for everyone.
And achieving that kind of peace will require a long and difficult process.
It will, but it's a process we absolutely have to undertake, both for the sake of the Palestinian people and for the future of humanity as a whole.
And it's important to acknowledge that while we've been focusing on the actions of the Israeli government, Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups also bear responsibility for their actions.
You're talking about the initial attacks on October 7th.
Yes, and their conduct throughout the conflict. Amnesty International actually has another report coming out soon that will look specifically at the crimes committed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups.
Right, so while our deep dive today is based on Amnesty's report about Israel's actions in Gaza, it's crucial to remember that this conflict has multiple layers of complexity and accountability.
There are no easy answers or simple narratives here.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about what can be done to prevent something like this from happening again.
It's a question that weighs heavily on all of us, I think.
Amnesty actually makes a number of recommendations in their report, directed at both Israel and the international community.
Okay.
They call on Israel to immediately end its occupation and system of apartheid against Palestinians.
Right, which, as we've discussed, they see as the root cause of this ongoing cycle of violence and oppression.
They also urge Israel to lift the blockade on Gaza to allow for the free flow of people and goods, ensuring that Palestinians have access to basic necessities, things like food, water, healthcare.
Right. It's about restoring that basic human dignity, recognizing the right of Palestinians to live a life free from fear and deprivation.
And it's about holding those who committed crimes accountable, regardless of their position or affiliation.
Right.
Amnesty also calls on the international community to take a more active role in promoting peace and justice in the region.
So that means things like suspending arms sales to Israel, imposing targeted sanctions on officials who were implicated in crimes, and supporting investigations by the International Criminal Court.
It's about ending the complicity that has allowed this conflict to continue for so long.
And recognizing that true peace can only be achieved through a just and sustainable solution that respects the rights and aspirations of both Palestinians and Israelis.
Finding that solution, though, will require a level of political will and courage that has been sorely lacking so far.
It will. But it's also the only path forward. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, to accept this as the inevitable status quo.
So as we leave you with this heavy but crucial topic, what's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is that, this isn't just some far-off conflict.
Right.
That has nothing to do with our lives, right?
Right.
What happened in Gaza, the dehumanizing rhetoric, the way international law seems to be eroding, these are all warning signs for us. They remind us what can happen when hatred and indifference are allowed to take root.
It's like a wake-up call for all of us.
Yeah.
We can't stay silent when faced with injustice.
Exactly. We each have a responsibility to help create a more just and peaceful world, and that starts with, being informed, understanding how complex these issues are, and being willing to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
So that wraps up our deep dive into the situation in Gaza. We hope this episode has challenged you, informed you, and maybe even inspired you to take action.
Yeah, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, seek out diverse perspectives, and engage in constructive dialogue about how we can all contribute to a more just and peaceful future.
Until next time, keep diving deep.